Hey, Memoir Junkies. Today's guest is poet and essayist Jane Wong, whose memoir, Meet Me Tonight in Atlantic City, is a stunning blend of lyricism, memory, and poetry. In it, she explores hunger, literal and emotional, alongside themes of abandonment, immigration, and a quiet strength of her mother. Her storytelling is both tender and fierce, revealing what it means to grow up longing for love and survival in equal measure. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Jane Wong. Hi, Jane. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. It's a kind of a little bit of a cloudy day here in Seattle, but otherwise not raining, so that's always a good thing for
That's
us.
good.
But yeah, I'm happy to be here, Erin.
I am so happy to have you here. I've been really looking forward to this conversation. So I thought maybe just to kick it off, for anybody who hasn't read your book, what can you tell us about it? Give us a little bit of a synopsis.
Yeah, that's such a funny question sometimes because I'm a poet
Hmm?
primarily, so I'm like, a synopsis. But yes, true. I do have to do that, especially having a memoir. So yeah, my book is called Meet Me Tonight in Atlantic City, and it's really a memoir about what it means to be, a immigrant, like, child of immigrants. Kind of a restaurant baby is what I call myself. It's kind of a memoir that's really celebrating, I think, a lot of like working class immigrants. I'm Chinese American, and I think that so much of this book um, sings forth so many of our stories that are often not told. And so it's really also a coming of age story too, I would say, into my own kind of like young adulthood. It's also a memoir that isn't about me, it's about my mother. And so I think a lot of kind of the misconceptions of like memoirs is just it's just about the author. And for me, it's really a story about my mother, who's kind of at the center of this book. But there's so much in here. I really hope that this book is both heartbreaking as much as it is funny. And there's a lot of research in this book as well. And so it's very lyrical, very poetic, but it also has a lot of research. And again, I think telling some of these stories that I think tend to get forgotten, especially within like my own community, and finding ways to maybe release some of the shame around some particular topics such as compulsive gambling addiction, which my father struggled with and led to the close of our restaurant. So it's about many things, but I think at its central core, it's about being a young woman trying to find her way in the world. And it's also very place-based. It's definitely very Jersey, and it's definitely very Pacific Northwest. It's so funny because so many people, when I've shared this book with them, who are from Jersey, when I did my tour in Jersey, are like, "What's Seattle doing in here?" I just love that attitude. It's like, "What's Seattle doing in here? Isn't this a Jersey book?" I'm like, "Yes, but I also live in Seattle."
Oh, that's so funny. Never mix the East and the West Coast, right?
Right, exactly. Totally funny. I just think it's hilarious to me, but I'm always going to be both.
Right, right. I'm sure a
So,
piece of your heart resides on either side.
yes.
So, given your background in poetry, because you are a very successful poet, what drew you to memoir to tell your story?
I love that question, Erin, because, the memoir is very poetic. It is very lyrical. I love imagery. It's like my favorite thing. And honestly, when we're thinking about memory and we're thinking about sharing our stories and storytelling, for me, that comes from a sensory place. It's about the things we smell, our taste buds, the things that jog memory back into kind of place. And so in many ways, memoir is kind of a natural place for me to go, I think, as a poet. That said, I guess I could have just stayed in poetry, but I realized that whenever I would do poetry readings, before I would read a poem, I would tell a story about what inspired the poem. And those stories I realized were pretty much essays or like larger, bigger stories that a poem can't encapsulate. And so in writing memoir, I felt like I finally had the room and the space to sprawl and tell those stories that are kind of like hidden in the poem, but now I get to have them fully fleshed out. And, um, you know, it gives these stories a bit more of space to I guess reflect upon what they mean to me too, because in a poem, we tend not to actually have reflection. It's kind of like, we don't tell people exactly how we feel, we just show it. And I think here I was kind of pushed to actually do a lot of that deep reflection on a more
Mhm.
personal level. So I really loved writing the memoir, but it was a challenge for sure, in terms of like sitting deep in those vulnerable, very vulnerable spaces. But I'm so glad I made the leap. And there are so many, I think, poets who are writing prose these days, because it offers a bit more space for us to kind of like dig into the stories we really want to tell. Um, and sometimes that means, going for 300 plus pages versus one page.
Right, right. So, on that note, can we talk a little bit about just the emotional landscape of your book? Like sitting with that emotion, like you just said. What were there any parts that you hesitated to put in, or any parts that you definitely knew that you wanted to include?
Such a great question. I think memoir generally as a genre is a very vulnerable space. It is a place where you are trying to make decisions as to what you are going to share and what you still omit. And in terms of what you omit, that's not necessarily like, oh, it's on the uh, cutting floor, like if it's been cut on the floor. I like idioms are like bizarre to me because like I feel like I think as a poet, and also I grew up in an immigrant household, so my mom always said bizarre things like taking a horse under the table, which didn't make any sense. Um, but yes, the scenes that get cut, it's not a matter of that. It's a matter of like what you decide to actually share and like what you still want to keep safe for yourself. And that's a great question in terms of a specific example from the memoir, which, the hardest chapter to write was a chapter called The Object of Love. And for that particular chapter, I really had that decision that I wasn't going to include that chapter or parts of that essay, which began as an essay, I put down because it really kind of like uh, you know, is very vulnerable to speak about, um, toxic relationships and domestic violence and abuse. Like it was very scary for me to do such a thing. And I put it away for 6 years actually, and I was pretty sure I wouldn't share it. But I think until I finally had that feeling like I was ready to do so and that I knew that there were going to be readers out there who felt seen as a result of me being a bit more vulnerable than I was even more comfortable with, I made the decision to have it in there. And I'm pretty proud of it. I feel like that's actually one of um, the chapters that I feel the most proud of. And I think it's because it took so much out of me to kind of share it. But yeah, I think it's always going to be a negotiation or a check-in with yourself. For any of you who are writing memoirs, like it is um, going to change year to year in terms of how comfortable you are with the subject matter at hand. But I did make that decision, and it was the first time I openly wrote about intimate partner violence and abuse, and it felt both terrifying and felt also really freeing at the same time.
I'm
Mhm.
sure. I'm sure. And I think it's so important. I think I know that's why I love memoir is it gives people the opportunity to kind of um, bare their soul, and somebody somewhere is going to connect to it and likely heal from it. Have you had any feedback specifically on that chapter?
I sure have. I actually, it surprises me that so many people are willing to share their own stories with me in terms of emotional abuse, physical abuse, like from intimate partners, and have it be also oftentimes like, people who also identify as Asian American and that's it's racialized too, having them share that specific experience that feels so, akin to mine. It's like it makes you feel less lonely in it. And
Right.
I oftentimes they're very young, like young, like in their 20s, the people who kind of like share that with me. And I feel I want to hold that very carefully. It's almost as if I am giving, them a hug, but also giving my younger self a hug too and trying to take care of them. So it's been really powerful. And so yes, it's been I think it's also like kind of halfway through the book, and so it's not, I mean, there are kind of references to the bad one and throughout the book, and but there's until you get to that chapter, there isn't like a deep reckoning with it. And so it was really, really incredible. I think that's the thing I couldn't have ever dreamed of, is like the people who respond to different emotional spaces of the book. I have been so just floored by how many people have come up to me. And that's very different from, I think, my experience in poetry. Because in memoir, you know that you are giving that vulnerability and having it echo back. Whereas in poetry, you know, it's not it's not as maybe a space where people feel willing to share their own stories back. So it's
Right.
yeah, it's just been this, yeah, special.
I've actually heard people metaphorically refer to writing a memoir as similar to giving birth to a baby because it's a piece of you, a piece of your heart and your soul that
Yeah.
goes into it.
Yeah.
I, I kind of agree with it, having done my own work myself.
Mhm.
You do a really great job, Jane. And I think that this is something that we all struggle with when it comes to writing memoir about your story is very family centric. We talked a little bit about a large percentage of it revolves around your mom and
Mhm.
also the absence of your dad.
Yes.
We all struggle with being able to write about those things without shedding a negative light on the people that we love. Tell
Right.
me about your process with that because you did it very well.
Yeah, that's a really great question because it's true. It's like I was just telling my students the other day, it's like you can't be the hero of your own story. Um, that you too have to be ethically complex, and so do all the characters in the book. They're real people. These are all real people. But as all real people are, they can't be perfect and they can't be completely demonized either, even though there is this kind of desire to say, paint my father as this kind of monstrous character. No, I couldn't. I had to give him empathy. I had to hold two things simultaneously at the same time, right? That he deeply, deeply wounded our family, my mother especially, and it's deeply painful. There are chapters in here where my brother's relationship with my father is, kind of explored. To Love a Mosquito, that chapter, where it breaks my heart as a sibling to see that estrangement happen, right? Especially between my brother and my father. And I have to hold that. I have to hold that rage and grief alongside my father's own, desire to live the life he wants to live, and his own, vulnerabilities and his own struggles and challenges through addiction, through um depression, through, not feeling like he's who he wants to be. And I want to hold that carefully. It's like if I could go back in time and like also give my dad a hug when he was little, like I would. And I think that's the hardest thing, is like it's not per se forgiveness, right? Which is a hard word to even like wrap one's head around, but it's to recognize the full humanity of somebody. And I think my father is one of those, characters or people that I feel complicated feelings towards, right? It's like, doing research for the title chapter of the book, Meet Me Tonight in Atlantic City, I realized that, my father's struggles with like addiction to alcohol, to gambling was something that was larger than him. It was systemic, because, casinos particularly target Asian American communities. And so it kind of gave me even more empathy for my father and understanding, even though there's some things that like terrify me in terms of like how he, treated my mother, what happened, to our family, the estrangement that occurred. But again, you have to hold both things at once. And that's always hard, I think. But you're right. I think it requires um like a refusal of a dichotomy, right? Like here are the good people in this story, here are the bad people. Like that doesn't work. Like everybody's complicated. Everybody is a little questionable, and we have to own our own actions, our own yeah, in that way. And that includes these real people in our lives. So yeah, thanks for saying. I was hoping, I struggled with it. I really, really was thinking about it hard when I was writing, was like, I don't want to demonize my father, but I also don't want to like, make my mom like this like absolutely picture perfect character either. So yeah, yeah, which is hard because like I do sometimes still see her as such, it like as a daughter, but as a writer, I had to do something different.
Well, I have to say bravo to you because I think a lot of people in life go their whole lives not being able um, to see what you just explained in terms of the complexity of human beings and to be able to forgive, just for lack of a better word, because one's not coming to me at the moment,
Yeah.
the flaws that came along with your
Yeah.
father. How much of that emotional growth took place while you were writing versus?
Yeah, totally. Great question. Yeah, it definitely happened while I was writing. I think that, this book took about, I want to say like 7 years-ish, 6 to 7 years. And I think in the writing that happens a lot. I think, and of course I was estranged by my father and I were estranged that whole time. And I think that, I wanted to spend more time with him um, via writing. It's like weird, but it's like I have a relationship with him because I'm writing about him, if that makes any sense. It was like a way to not be estranged, was to kind of work through my feelings around our relationship. And after the book was published, he unfortunately had a stroke, and so my brother and I made this decision to go visit him and see him after, who knows, like 15, 16 years of estrangement. And I don't think I would have been able to see him if I didn't write the book. And so I'm really grateful for the book to actually um activate something, I think, in me to reach out to him. And I think that's the other thing people forget is that memoirs keep living past them being published, is that like life keeps going, and so there's almost like a kind of always like a postscript or something, and I'm always trying to kind of think about, oh, like what did the book also make happen, like in terms of my healing, but also like, okay, like in real time, like how will this impact my relationships for years to come? I have no idea, but it's a the book is alive. Yeah, it
It
is.
absolutely is. Sometimes I wish we could come back around and write additional epilogues.
Right. Exactly. Right. Exactly. Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
To keep everybody posted on what's
It's
going. Because you're right, it
that's
just kind
it.
of is static in that spot, but life
Hmm.
goes on.
Life goes
Something
on.
that really struck me about your writing, apart from your lyrical structure, which I just thought was, I don't know how you did it, but it was absolutely beautiful how it all just kind of flowed together without any real chronological order.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very poetic. But one of the first things I noticed is that you use organs of the body and their corresponding elements in traditional Chinese medicine as to frame out the structure, basically. So you have heart fire, kidney water, liver wood, lungs metal, spleen earth. Tell me about that. Can you kind of give a little bit of insight into why you chose that and what it means?
Oh yeah, yeah. That particular chapter really explores, 'cause I've always been obsessed with food. I mean, I grew up in a restaurant, which is partly you know, this memoir is partly about kind of growing up in a restaurant, but it kind of extends from there. And I was thinking a lot in that chapter about nourishment and just like the ways in which we nourish each other, like literally in terms of food, and just exploring what that means when that can be potentially even taken away from you, I suppose. Or so it was like really, I knew it was going to be a chapter about nourishment and like all the complicated feelings I have around it. But I was like, I was struggling to like write it as like a more linear kind of approach. The book more broadly is very nonlinear or very lyrical in its structure, because that's kind of how memory works. That's what happens when, you come from a history of displacement and migration and, when things can't quite come out in a beginning, middle, end way, right? Like that's not how it works, especially with my family and thinking about intergenerational trauma too. But um, in thinking about that particular chapter, I wanted it to be about this kind of sense of the body and like healing. Like in traditional Chinese medicine, you know, everything is about the body, right? And what your heart needs. Like sometimes I remember my mom would have me drink particular soups because something she felt that some part of my body was not, you know, like acting in the way it should. And so it's like, oh, for your feet, you should have this, or like for your heart, you should have this. And so I kind of always grew up with that, like in my mind, that anything could be healing if you just listens closer to the body too, and like pay attention to the body, but also that food and like how you eat something and is going to affect it. And so I use that as kind of a larger metaphor, I think, for what it means to heal emotionally or kind of like nourish oneself emotionally. And so I found it like a really helpful structure for me, I think. As you can probably tell in the memoir, I love form and I love structure because for me as a poet, that is how you show the emotional weight. Like you could feel through a structure. And I love vignettes or I love kind of fragments because it's to me, it's like building a constellation, like you're building the story in this way. It's not a linear approach. And so I'm also asking the reader to come with me and do some of the work, I guess, too, of building the constellations. And in many ways, it's like I'm inviting you to kind of consider too. It's like, what is this structure, this form doing to you? When I write, for instance, there's a chapter called Root Canal Street that's kind of like in the form of like a dental assistant kind of yelling out what's happening, like numbering the teeth and stuff like that. And I just love that structure as this kind of like um, hopefully playful approach to a pretty serious topic. And so I'm always thinking about that. I'm always thinking about how is the form affecting you and how do we destabilize our expectations as to what a story is supposed to be. And that's my favorite part of it too, that storytelling happens in so many different ways. And I hope that we're, open to kind of try it out. Otherwise, I didn't want to hold the reader's hand throughout the whole book. Um, you know, I I didn't want to tell them that story. I wanted them to feel the story. And so hopefully it happens.
No, I absolutely think you hit the nail on the head. It felt very much like an experience for
Yeah,
me.
yeah, that's what I was
Did
hoping
you
for.
did you find yourself struggling like to strike the balance of your poetic self and turning it into a memoir? Like how did that tell me a little bit about that? I can imagine you were probably had a little bit of push and pull.
Oh, always, always. I think I'm very grateful for my incredible editor, Elizabeth DeMio, who would totally pull me back from poetry land and would say, really, she would just often say, I want you to stay here longer and I want you to reflect on how you felt then, how you feel now. Just stay there longer to really reflect. I mean, that's ultimately it, is that I could do a lot of flips and turns with images and metaphors. And I loved writing in scene. I think um sometimes my strongest work is like being in scene and like the dialogue and like body language and the air and the smell of the air and the taste of this. Like I'm very, very sensory. But that can just go so far, right? You kind of have to sit there and reflect on like, what does this mean to me? Or like, bigger picture, like how did this affect me? How is it continuing to affect me? And I feel really proud of those moments where I actually did that because I think it adds that balance. Um, but at the same time, it's like if you have too much of that or almost too much exposition, you're losing some of the through, like feeling through something versus it being about something. And so it was a really hard process, but I'm glad that I was able, hopefully, to kind of balance it out. But I think that, you know, it is very clearly, a space of, poetic play. And I hope too that, readers who come to this book are open to some of my weird imagination. In many ways, like I still feel like a kid. Like I feel like I'm always like dreaming of what animals live in those clouds. And so this book is very also imaginative in that way too, like the way that I describe certain things. Like, and that happens in revision. Like there's this section where I talk about throwing an egg in a parking lot. And in it, it's like, I write like, my father sloshes an aquarium of whiskey. And to me, that's very poetic, but that's very specific. I use the word aquarium to get a sense of how much, how big that is. It's not literal. It can't be, but it is, I want to get that emotion across. That's like how massive that is. Not literally in terms of how much he's drinking, but also emotionally, like how much that is in his heart and body in that time. So I think poetry also asks for specificity too. Um, but yeah, it's a great question. It was a balance.
I can only imagine. You did it. It was very artistic, especially the metaphor of your dad in the with the swimming in the aquarium of whiskey. There were a number of pieces. I feel like I could pull them out one by one. I honestly, though, if you have one that you would like to read to us, I would love to hear you
Yeah.
read a piece that you've chosen.
Of course. Yeah, thanks, Erin. Maybe just because we were just talking about that section, I'll go ahead and read the very beginning of that chapter, A Cheat Sheet for Restaurant Babies, which is formally written as a kind of like a how-to
Great.
for the next restaurant kid, which after my family sold the restaurant because my father's debts from gambling were too large. There's always another family like living or like living and like, owning that like another Chinese restaurant in that same space. It's always been a Chinese restaurant, but it's always like a new family. And so there's always a new restaurant baby. It's like weird, but it's like looking at yourself through the glass of the restaurant. So I wrote this kind of for the other kid who comes after me. Um, but yeah, this is the beginning of a cheat sheet for restaurant babies. How to lob an egg into a parking lot. Wait until it's dark, settled in dark, not sunset dark, say 9 p.m. The sound of breaking is better when you can't see it happening. When your father isn't looking, go to the fridge and steal 2 eggs from the bottom of the carton stack and wrap them up in a small towel, folding the towel like you would an origami cup. Sneak out through the back of the restaurant, mind the potholes, and circle around front to the parking lot. Unfold the towel and give your little brother 1 egg. When he says the egg is too cold and it smells rotten like unbrushed teeth, tell him to shut up. Ground your heels into the gravel as you imagine baseball pitchers do to gain traction. Give all your anger over to the egg. Breathe your hot breath on it. Hold it up to the sky like an offering, a sacrifice, this careful thing that could have grown into something else. Tell your brother there's nothing to be afraid of. Tell him to stop shaking. He's no incubator. With your arm bent back at 45 degrees, hurl the egg high into the air, into an arch any city would welcome as a bridge. Hurl the egg and do not think about anything. Not about how your father sloshes an aquarium of whiskey, not about the growing piles of bills you will have to translate later. You must give the egg all of it. You can open your eyes or close them. It won't matter since you won't see it land, but you will hear it. You will hear your brother squeal like a pig at mealtime. You'll hear the splat, the crepuscular glob of the yolk spreading across the hood of a car. Poor car, you'll think. Poor, stupid car. So I'll pause there.
Mm, wow, thank you for that.
Yeah.
What did you learn about yourself while writing this?
So much. You know, I think the biggest thing I learned, and thinking about even just that passage I read about the egg, that throwing an egg takes like probably seconds. But it's like when I slowed down that scene, it's like so much got wrapped up into the egg, right? Like years go by almost, of the bills that have to be translated, of my mother's rage, my father's, drinking and his gambling. And I realized that like time collapses, right? And so in writing the memoir, I started to like collapse time and I learned a lot about myself as a result of that. I think that, when you look back at the things that have happened to you, there's a kind of there's a bit of a sadness, of course, or kind of like grief and some of the things that are quite challenging that, many people experience, at least for me, like the heartbreak and the grief and the violence too. Um, but also I learned too that from a distance, when you're able to almost collapse time, you're almost able to give more empathy to those younger selves of yours. And I think that's the biggest thing I learned while I was writing this memoir was that like I need to be tender to myself. I need to be kinder to myself. If I I'm so hard on myself like today, like, daily as a person who's like in their 40s now. But why would I be so kind to my younger self? Like I want to so badly like to tend to and take care of like my 20-year-old self, my 4-year-old self, my 30-year-old self. Why can't I give myself currently that same tenderness? And so I've learned a lot from writing this book to just be more gentle and easeful to my own self, which is like a weird thing I didn't expect from this book and writing this book was like to be so um
To give yourself grace.
to give myself grace. And I am still working through it. I'm still realizing that that's something that I need to give myself, but I needed to give that to my younger selves first. And that's partly due to that collapsing of time, which, a memoir does collapse time. I mean, you can't, regardless, it's like, how do you fit that many years in like these pages, right? Like you have to pick and choose. For any memoirist out there, it's like you can't have it all. You have to choose the things that you want to be in here. And that requires a collapsing of time. And that requires deep reflection too. Yeah.
So, do you think that 60-year-old Jane will have to do less loving and caring and nurturing for the 40-year-old Jane than the 40-year-old Jane does for the 6, 10, 15, 20-year-old Jane?
I think so. I mean, in my dream of it, in my speculative dream of it, I think that my older self really will be more tender, I think, over and over the years to come, that I might not have to hold myself as tightly as I do now. I think for a lot of the book that where I'm like kind of in my like late 20s, early 30s, there's so much pain, I think, especially in my intimate, you know, partner relationships. I almost felt like I was constantly grasping onto my own hands. Like I needed to hold my own hand, otherwise I would kind of like fall somewhere, And I'm like loosening the grip of that. And I think over time, that probably is going to happen. Like even that, what it means to be outside of constant catastrophe, like the fear of it. In many ways, this book, I don't know if it made me less afraid, but I think like writing it, but I think it did give me a lot more understanding that, you know, I have a community, I have people in my life writing about all these characters. This book, in many ways, is about friendship too. And I realized that, there is so much. You don't, until you sit down and you kind of work through it all, you don't realize how expansive, I guess, like your communities are until you address them. And so I like that. And I think that that's only going to grow as I get older. And some people have said to me, and I try to take it as nicely as possible. But some folks have come up to me after reading like, "Oh, you're too young to write a memoir." And I'm just I try to sit with that because I'm just like, what does that even mean? I'm too young to write a memoir because I think at the very yeah, I'm just like I experienced a lot of life, so
Yep.
it's not about age, right? But as I mentioned at the top of this podcast, like this book is also about my mother, and it's her memoir as much as it is mine. And my mom's in her 60s, so it's kind of like yeah, me in that version of myself later. And I wanted to write this book also to speak to her life too, and that it's going to be this continual, lineage of experience. And funny story I'll say is that she came to my book launch in Seattle, and she went on book tour with me in New Jersey, and she started to sign books. And I just thought it was so funny because she was like, "Well, I made you, so I made this book," and I was like, "What?"
At
How does
least a
that
little bit of credit.
Yes, exactly. So I just love that. This is so funny. Yeah, she started to sign some books. Um, but yeah, I think, I can only look towards my mother as also somebody who gives a lot of tenderness towards her younger selves too, and has forgiven a lot of her, you know, forgiven her younger selves too for the things they have done and said. And, so yeah, I'm assuming it'll just be a process.
Yeah, I think it's an ongoing process. It does sound like for you specifically, though, pulling your story together has created a tremendous amount of spiritual growth and emotional
Yes.
growth, right? Wow, that's fabulous. I love hearing stories like that. How has it changed? how has it changed how you view your relationships since?
Yeah, it definitely has. I think that, with particular people in my life, I think my mother, when the book came out and she was able to read it via audiobook, which was like really special to me. I was able to record that in my own voice, which um, wasn't necessarily the first option. I think, I had audition tapes from other readers and I really wanted to read it in my own voice and I was able to, luckily. But my mom was able to listen to the book. And I think that what surprised me is that she didn't realize how much um, I think she always knew I love her, but I just I don't think that she really knew to what degree. And so it was really moving. I think it brought us closer, even closer. I think when the book came out, I think also, my brother, you know, it's so interesting too, because like in the book, and it's true in real life, he's just such a tender human being. He's just a very quiet guy who like just wants so badly to hold and support the people he loves. And he chose not to read the book. And I thought that that was a really interesting decision as kind of like it would hurt him, I think, to a certain degree. He, of course, read the passages in which he appears in because, permissions, like he has to give permission, but he chose not to read the book as a whole. And I think it was like self-protective. I think it would have been too hard for him to read it. And that, in many ways, I have to honor that and hold that too as you know, I respect that, and
Sure.
it was surprising to me though. At first I was like, what do you mean you don't want to read this book? Like I wrote it. Um, but I understand. I understand. And as I mentioned before, I think after I wrote this book, I was able to go see my father for the first time in over a decade. So that was really powerful too.
Mm.
And I think too, it also healed a lot, like some of the terrible ex-boyfriends that live in this book. Like I was able to almost not exercise them, but kind of like it's really
Yeah.
see you later. And so
Yeah.
yeah, and I remember too, like in the process of like making this book, like I didn't date, and this is like again the postscript of sorts. I didn't date for 2 full years. Like I didn't at all. Like after my, I split with my ex-fiance, I didn't date. And so in many ways it was like a time of like focusing on the book, the making of the book. Like it was you talk about the book being kind of like like birthing it or like a baby. I was just
Hmm.
like my book is also simultaneously like my partner. It's like kind of weird, but it's like I'm kind of in like love with like writing. Like too. It's like kind
Yeah.
of it became a thing I was like attending to in a way that was like I had to show up. I had to be committed to my book. And so as much as it is a baby, it's also weirdly like my like partner.
Sure. That makes perfect sense to me. It
Yeah.
does.
Uh,
You mentioned several times throughout, and I heard you just made a comment a second ago that reminded me of it about your research on how to not be afraid of everything. Tell us a little bit about that. Where are you now?
yeah, that's the title of my second poetry collection, which I wrote simultaneously with the memoir. So they have a lot of linkages actually, and maybe some people can see that, but I know I can see it. But regardless, I know they're separate projects, but I wrote them at the same time. And I definitely did not reach a conclusion about fear. I think that if anything, I was writing about the things I'm afraid of in order to make them less scary, really,
Mm.
honestly, that is that there's no answers. There's no way for me to articulate anything that helps me in that besides community. I think that being afraid together is something very different, or being rageful together is very something different when you're alone in that feeling. And so I think also just like being blunt and speaking directly to the things that I'm afraid of was like in itself the thing that um kind of untethered me to this kind of like constant um anxiety around like what people think of me or like
Mm.
who I'm supposed to be or like oh my God, is the world crumbling apart? Like this constant catastrophe mode. And I think that writing about what I'm afraid to write about got me closer to like loosening some of that fear. Though it certainly doesn't loosen the knots of it, but I certainly think it helps. I always tell my students too, it's like my students are like, I don't I don't know how to write about this. I'm stuck. I don't think I have anything to write about. Or I'm just like, just write about that, like feeling stuck, like feeling like you don't know what to say, and writing about how you're struggling to write it. Like that's where that happens, like admitting to the actual processing of it
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
helps a lot.
Yeah. Facing the boogeyman.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's a job that never ends, to your
It
point.
never ends.
So you'll
Exactly.
face another boogeyman sometime down the
Exactly.
road, right?
Precisely. Yes.
Given your nonlinear format, I'm interested to know, how did you know when you were done? How did you know that you could put a shiny red bow on
When my editor told me I was done, I'm just kidding, but
it?
kind of.
Editors are
Um,
heroes.
uh, that's it, really, is that like you also need somebody who is able to look at it from a totally different perspective and be like,
Mm,
this is what you need to add, but also like you can take this out or I can end here. I mean, for me, um, my editor was really asking for more. I wasn't ever in a position in which it was like, cut, 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 because I think because I'm a poet, it's hard for me to put words like right after each other. It was just like I
right.
remember distinctly, I think I wrote 200 pages in like 2 weeks because I just was trying to put one word in front of the other. And then I revised intensely, but that was my goal, was just like put words down. Um, and so for me, it's like, it's hard. It's hard to end something like a memoir, right? Especially one that doesn't have like one singular thread or like one singular concept. And so I think for me, it still lingers. The book, like you said, yeah, it definitely feels like I could add a whole nother chapter or two to it. But I think that it feels done in a sense of like, um, that kind of like the things I'm grappling with, the questions that I'm grappling with feel tended to, I suppose. Like I don't feel like I still have a bunch of questions from some of the things that I address in here. I still feel like life keeps lifing, so there's that, but I feel comfortable at least with the amount I put in terms of that vulnerability. I don't think in many ways like a book ends because you like that's all you have in you, you
Right.
know? Sometimes that's part of it. It's just like I don't have any more to give. And when people ask me, it's like, oh, you're gonna write another memoir, I'm just like, oh, what? Oh no, definitely did not consider that because your body also literally has to like replenish itself like after something like that. That doesn't happen to me in poetry. I'll be clear. I don't feel the same way after writing a poem. Uh, this felt kind of like I needed to like not write for a year and I didn't write really for a year and a half after I finished this book, which is rare for me. I tend to write a lot, but I think I just needed to like be like, oh, that took a lot out of me, and like that, I'm good for now.
Take a break. I guess I didn't realize that you wrote your poetry book is called Overpour, correct?
There's two, yeah,
So,
Overpour and How to Not Be Afraid of Everything.
and How to Not Be Afraid of Everything. I don't think I realized that was a whole separate book. So were
Yeah.
you writing that one in tandem with Meet Me Tonight in Atlantic City?
And to be honest, I'm glad they were because I think anytime I was scared or felt overwhelmed by working on the memoir, I kind of like pivoted to poetry and was able to kind of like take time in that space. And so
Yeah.
I Yeah, so that was a good, I think How to Not Be Afraid of Everything, that poetry book took 5 years to write. And so this one's about 7, so it just took a little longer. But I wrote these books at the same time, which I think generally as a structure, in terms of working on two things at once, I think might be something I really enjoy. I think I don't like feeling like I'm almost like too obsessed with something. It's like tunnel
Hmm.
vision. Like I felt like when I did have to work on this book intensely for like a year, like when it sold, like I felt like it was my whole life. Like I was like, oh my gosh, like there's only this. Whereas like when I was working on two books, I felt more free and able to move between things.
Right.
And
Because you
so
get writer's block. So it's nice to be able to kind of take a
exactly,
break and move to something else for a little while.
totally, totally. And so I think I'm hoping to continue that kind of approach moving forward. It's like always to have
Mm-hmm.
two projects so that I don't get stuck or obsessed in a
Mm.
way that's like maybe unhealthy. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I actually just recently started working on a second piece myself, and I feel like
Mm,
first piece is flowing better because I'm not constantly
right.
racking my brain about where to go next with it.
That's it.
Yeah. Let's talk about your publishing experience. What
Yeah.
was your path to publishing like? What did you choose? What kind of challenges did you run into?
Yeah, because I have a background in poetry, I think that um like having already some publications and books within that kind of like field or that realm, I felt like I had some opportunities to kind of like write CNF like essays basically. I was invited to contribute to an anthology called This is the Place, women writing on place and home. And that was pretty much my first essay. It's called in the anthology a family business, but it's basically a cheat sheet for restaurant babies or like the earlier draft of that. And so like once I sent that in and was like solicited for that, I realized I was like, oh, actually really love writing essays. It was a new form for me, but I really enjoyed it. And so I started to write more and more and was able to place some of these essays in literary journals and other anthologies. And until it became a thing where I was like, wait a second, I think there is probably a book here or a memoir. And I think that once I started to gather them, I think I had about 90 pages of
Mm.
essays that, eventually when Tin House took the book, we had to kind of think through like, what does the rest of the book look like, right? The other 300, not 300, but 200-ish pages, and kind of outlining that and thinking about a through line. When I first, was speaking to the folks at Tin House, I really pitched it as an essay collection because that's what I had been writing, essays. And it still kind of exists in this way because it's also really like what also is genre in terms of like what's a memoir, what's an essay collection. These are just me, these like kind of not I shouldn't say silly parameters, but it's like in my mind it's like it's all the same in some way.
Right.
But in a memoir, there's a through line. There is something that's clearly like pulling you through that feels a little more cohesive in a way. And so that's really what I worked hard on with my editor and the Tin House team was to kind of like find ways for me to um, publish it in a way, aka a memoir versus an essay collection, that felt like it could have like a larger kind of cohesive picture. And that was a challenge. I think when I first was kind of like speaking to them, I was very intimidated by it being a memoir versus a collection. But it was also a fun challenge to kind of like try it out. That's kind of my pathway through publication. I think that connecting with Tin House was kind of a weird, kind of happy accident of sorts because, um, in many ways, like they asked me, like if I was working on a poetry collection, and I was working on this instead. And so it's like, and I was like, well, I have this. And so and I think I heard back from them within a week. It was pretty fast, in terms of them taking the book. But yeah, there's more to that journey in terms of like I was working with a literary agent that wasn't quite the right fit um,
Mm.
prior to the relationship I had with Ted House. And so I had to kind of resolve that in some way. So I was, when I sold the book to Tin House, unagented. Um, and so, I'm glad it's like the right press for me in the sense of like the book is a lo quite non-linear and plays with a lot of different lyrical elements. So it feels right to be on Tin House, which I think with other presses that maybe wouldn't have been the right fit too. So I think publishing generally is a journey in which you're trying to find the right fit. I mean, that's it. It's not so much like who's going to publish my work. It's like where can it live and thrive?
Mm.
So I feel really great and strong that Tin House was able to really give this book a cozy home.
Happy to hear it. I've heard before, I can't remember where I heard somebody say that choosing a publisher is basically just choosing who you will argue the best with.
Oh my God, that's funny.
Who you can get the best argument dialogue going with so you can go
Uh-huh.
back and forth. I agree. I think it's probably mostly a personality fit and a fit for what you're trying to do also, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
What was the most surprising thing about sharing your story with the world?
Mm. I think the most surprising thing was how many people I think came up to me afterwards if I was doing an event that shared about, somebody in their family who struggles with gambling. I think that was most surprising because I realized that we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it. Like really. Since this book came out, I've been really honored to be part of a few panels and conferences where um, there are other specialists on like addiction and oftentimes specifically like alcohol addiction, drug use, but like I was like the only one that was on there for gambling and it was just so surprised like it's such a huge um, uh, it's huge, like,
There are
and
hotlines for it.
yes,
Yeah,
yes,
it's a big deal.
exactly.
Yeah.
And but yeah, it's something that people just don't talk about, and especially
Mm.
within, the Asian American community, it's just like there's so many stigmas attached to it, and so many people came up to me and shared that, their uncle kind of struggles with this, or their aunt, or their mother, their father, or their grandmother, and one of the most powerful experiences I had since I was on tour was it was in Jersey, and I was doing a reading, and this person came in and like sat in the back and was listening and came up to me afterwards and was like, and this person's Vietnamese American and was like, oh, I actually am like doing a photo shoot across the street. I'm like, the photographer, like, or something like that. I can't remember what role they played in the photo shoot. But they were like, but I just saw as I was walking past the window that there was an Asian American person like, speaking. So I just popped in and I was listening. And then like when you were sharing about your father, like, like, both my parents like struggled with that. And I was like, whoa, what a weird coincidence that I needed to hear your words about that because I've never been able to express how I feel about casinos and like the casino culture and what they did in many ways to kind of like lead to the destruction of our family in this way. And so stuff like that happens to me so often. And I'm just like, wow, like I was not expecting that at all. That immense connection to my community and like people coming up to me and sharing things that they didn't really share with anyone else before. And like loosening some of that shame. Yeah, that probably was the most like, surprising. Being on tour, I think like generally was like I did not expect people connecting with me in these ways. Like, wow, am so like surprised and honored that people are even reading it. But I think that's part of it. It's just like, wow. Yeah.
Makes it all worth it, right? It makes all
Yes.
the work and all the tears and all the vulnerability worth
hmm
it when you know that you
Yes.
can connect to even just one other person, let alone
Exactly.
a whole tribe of people that are
Yeah.
feeling very similar things.
Right. Right.
Yeah. What do you hope readers will take away from your book?
I readers take away quite a few things, but I think the biggest thing is um, like so much of Asian American stories, I think, are always like couched in seeing kind of like there are relationships that are challenged or like oh like the trauma of like familiar relationships and migrations like all these things like do exist in some ways in this book and yes there is trauma but I really also hope this book is funny and I think it's like joyful and there's like so much play in this book. And so I really, really wanted to emphasize that as I was writing is like, yes, this is, my story, my mother's story, my father's story, like the people in my family. But and that's painful at times, right? And heartbreaking at times. But I really hope people take away that there's so much resilience and like love and strength in this book too, and humor. And I hope people laugh in this book and just like even just like the title of like one of the chapters, Root Canal Street, I thought it was funny. Like it's just a joke. It's a joke, right? It's like you basically laugh in order to stop yourself from crying. And so like I really want that to be the takeaway too. That it's like not a one-dimensional quote unquote sad book. Like it's not a sad book. It's also a joyful book. And I
It
really,
is.
yeah, I want to get that feeling across.
And there's a lot of beauty too. There's one piece, I believe it's near the end, if memory serves, where
Mhm.
you're sharing a mango with your mom.
Yes. Hmm.
Your mom are just hanging out and you're sharing a mango with your mom. And I think that
Yeah.
like those are the things that we lose sight of when we get bogged down in all of the drama.
Yes. That's it. That's
A lot of beauty
absolutely
in
it.
those simple moments, right?
Yeah, yeah. That the book has hopefully, for readers, a lot of beauty in it. And I even told like, when Tin House asked me like, what's the vibe or mood of what you would want for the cover? I was like, I want color. I want vibrancy. I just didn't want like a stark. I wanted this, and I'm really proud of the cover to me.
Beautiful.
So
Yeah.
even the back of the paperback, like it just gives me joy. And I like, yeah, there's so much like pain in this book, but it's like, yeah, the mango, So
Yep.
I appreciate you saying that, but that's really my takeaway is like it's all simultaneous, right? That joy as much as there is that heartbreak, the humor as much as there is um, you know, you know, systemic racism in here. Like there's so much, but it's all co
There
being
is.
coexist.
It,
Yeah.
they do. They do. It is chock full of hard topics, but you did it. You did it very well.
Ah,
You
thanks,
talk a
Erin.
lot about dictate. What
Mhm.
other books changed your life or book changed your life?
Oh, wow. Um, wow, that's a hard one because I'm also a professor and there's like so many books that like impact me fundamentally. I always come back to poetry, so that's part of it. But I always love the poet Lucille Clifton. I feel like Lucille Clifton is one of my favorite poets ever, mostly because when she writes with a kind of like invocation or like she's almost kind of trying to right to find a kind of answer to something and she doesn't get the answer. So it's kind of like it's hard to describe her poetry, but it's like they're short often, very short poems that you almost have to reread over and over again. But in one of her poems, um, she writes, it's won't you celebrate with me? Towards the end of that poem, she's like, won't you celebrate with me that something has tried to kill me every day and has failed? I'm paraphrasing, but I just
Mhm.
love that because it's like, what? Like, yeah, like that survival, but also like the reworking of that celebration of like, yeah, I'm here. And so it's
Yep.
just wow. Like, so Lucille Clifton, like get her collected poetry like ASAP. Like every single time I read one of her poems, I like live in there for like years. Like I'm like I have to reread it over and over again. But definitely Lucille Clifton.
I will definitely check it out.
Yeah.
Where can people find you and what's find out what's next and where can we get a copy of your beautiful book?
Thanks, Erin. Um, uh, let's see. I mean, I have a website. I haven't updated in a while, which I should. I always feel kind of like, oh my gosh, like time is such a funny thing and like things happen. I'm just like, how do we like update people? But it's just janewongwriter .com, which makes me laugh because somebody's definitely sitting on janewong.com. I'm like, who is it? So strange. So I'm there and I'm on socials on Instagram. My handle is at Parade of Cats, which has nothing to do with my writer name, but I just think it's funny. I'm also a ceramicist, and so that account is like at Restaurant Baby Ceramics, so that's pretty fun. Like I make like giant like weird sculptures and stuff like that. And you can find my book at your lovely local bookstores, but of course through Tin House, their website too, and I usually love Bookshop too, where you can find this lovely Meet Me Tonight in Atlantic City. I'm very pleased that the paperback is out and about because I love paperbacks. I feel like you can just throw them in a bag and I also just love that they're just flippity floppity. Um, and Yeah, I think what's next, I'm actually working on, speaking of multiple projects, two things, a book of poems that is really exploring seeds, basically. My mom's a farmer, grew up as a farmer, and she seed saves, and her garden's incredible. So it's really thinking about growth in many ways and seed saving and all that, a kind of eco poetics too of sorts. And then I'm working on a fiction project that is something that is surprising me, and it's definitely horror. So it's short
No
stories. So
kidding.
yes,
I look forward to seeing what you pull out with that.
yes, yes.
Also,
Taking
in your
it from CNF for now for writing memoir. Yeah.
little bit of a break, a little bit more creative on the creative side.
Right.
Good. And you're bouncing back and forth between your poetry and this fiction novel that you're working.
Mhm. I am. I am.
Excellent. Well,
Yeah.
this has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you again so much for taking the time and thanks for reading a piece. I will put all of your links down in the show notes too, so that people can,
Awesome.
go in and order your book and find you at your various social media pages. For now, take care.
Yeah, you too. Bye, Erin.
Thanks so much for listening to For Love of Memoir. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like, follow, and share the show. It really helps us reach more memoir lovers like you. You can find links to today's guest, their work, and anything we mentioned in the episode right in the show notes. Until next time, keep writing your story.